Gaudete, gaudete, Christus es natus, ex Maria Virgine gaudete.
Welcome to the Rediscovery channel. This is the channel where I, Ivor Kovac, and my good friends Stilgar and Great Pharaoh take turns coming up with topics from history that the other person hasn't heard about and usually doesn't know about. And today, however, it is just me and my good friend Great Pharaoh. Stilgar is not with us today. So I'm going to go ahead and get to my topic, which is the Muslim conquest of Spain. So, Great Pharaoh, do you know anything about the Muslim conquest of Spain?
As far as the Muslim conquest of Spain, maybe I've heard of it briefly, but yeah, it's been a while.
So this topic is actually in response to a user request long time ago, a couple months ago, I think, maybe a year ago. We had somebody that asked us how the Muslims took over Spain and why. So what I want to do is address those two questions with this topic, but also I have to say that this is kind of like part 3 in my series on the Muslim conquest. So the first one was the Muslim conquest of Egypt, and then the next one is the Muslim conquest of Maghreb, and then that brings us to this one, which is the conquest of Spain. So the Muslim conquest of Egypt ran from 631 to 641, and that was accomplished by the Rashidun Caliphate, and of course they were helped by Cyrus of Alexandria being such a traitor, a willing traitor. And then the Muslim conquest of the Maghreb comes next, and that runs from 647 to 705 AD. And that is mostly going to be accomplished by the Umayyad Caliphate. And the Umayyads took over in 661. So after the Muslim conquest of the Maghreb, the last Byzantine holding in Africa is Ceuta, which still exists today. And I think today Ceuta is actually part of Spain, but it is in North Africa. So what I want to do is talk about a little bit about the history of Spain leading up to the time when the Muslims arrived there. So at the time of the conquest, Spain was actually ruled by the Visigoths, and the Visigoths were a group of Germanic barbarians who came down and conquered a big part of Western Europe. And so in 410 AD, Rome is sacked by Alaric the Visigoth. He was a Visigoth. And then the last Roman Empire is actually deposed in 476. The Visigoths are going to enter Spain in the year 416. So let me just say, there's a little bit of time period when the Western Roman Empire is still technically in existence, but has like almost no power at all. It's just coming to pieces. So you can look at 410 to 476 as, the empire, the Western Empire still officially exists, but doesn't have any real power of any significance. So the Visigoths, after sacking Rome, they basically decide to settle in France and Spain. They enter Spain in 416 as allies of the Romans, ostensibly to reestablish Roman control over the peninsula. We say allies, I'd say like allies, finger quotes kind of thing. So officially they're allies, but realistically they're doing whatever they want to do, and they're going to do it anyways. So in 418, they were actually recalled up into France, the Visigoth army, and they established their capital at a place called Toulouse. I may be saying wrong.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I'll put it, French pronunciations are kind of tough for me. I'll put it in the slideshow, the spelling. So originally, they control most of Spain from their capital of Toulouse. That is during the early days of the Visigoth kingdom. But in the late 400s, they get into conflict with the Franks. So the Franks are another group of Germanic invaders that takes over Gaul, the Roman province of Gaul, which today we call France. So conflict starts after King Clovis of the Franks converts to Catholicism. And bearing in mind that all these Germanic cultures, originally they were pagan polytheists. They believed in Odin and Thor and Frigga, Loki, all that stuff, Asgard. To my knowledge, there were no apostles or early missionaries that went up to these Germanic peoples. Their first exposure to any form of Christianity was when they started to push south and become exposed to Catholicism, which was ubiquitous throughout the Western Roman Empire in the late stages of the empire. So the Visigoths, actually, they were Arians. They adopted Arianism, the heresy, which we talked about in some other videos. And so Clovis, who was the king of the Franks, he was offended by that. And it seems like their theological argument escalated to physical fighting. And so the Visigoths ended up losing most of their holdings in France. The Franks killed Alaric II in 507, which causes the Visigoths to shift their capital into Spain. And so eventually they decide on a city called Toledo. During this time, however, it was called Toletum. It still had the old Roman names had not yet been garbled to their current pronunciations. So the Visigoths have a difficult time assimilating with the population of Spain because of their adherence to Arianism. So the Western Roman Empire was Catholic, most of them, like probably I'd say at least upwards of 90%. There might have still been some pagans that were kind of secretly doing their thing, but Catholicism is the official religion, and it was the only denomination that existed at the time in that part of the world. So, of course, Arians they don't think that Jesus is God. They think he was created by God, right? Great Pharaoh. See.
Yeah. Well, the Arian heresy, they're basically, I think they're counting as the Father and the Son are greater than the Holy Spirit, something along those lines, or that God created the Father created the Son, right? Or that the Son was basically like a body, that it was representing God, but the Son was just a body, and that it's just the Father. So it's basically a heresy against the Trinity, that they're not equal, that they don't they didn't coexist together from the beginning. So yeah, it's just heresy against the Trinity.
Yeah, so that was the religion that the Visigoths had, and they're still going to have it when they go into Spain. And the thing is, like Spain at this time, like if you go to Spain today, there's actually 3 different languages that are spoken there. You have the main language, which is Spanish, which most people speak. Then you have another language called Catalonian, and that's what they speak in. I think it's Barcelona. It's kind of in the Catalonia is in the north east of Spain. It's a different language. It's a Romance language, but it's not mutually intelligible with Spanish. And then you have the Basque language. However, back then, the whole Iberian Peninsula, with the exception of the Basque population, was all speaking Latin. And they were speaking Latin. They were fairly homogenous culturally. They identified as, Romans. And the same is also true of Gaul and Italy. Like it was before the time when Latin had split into the Romance family. So that's what, the Catholic Church, they have all sorts of Latin liturgies. Everybody would have just understood it. It was their first language. It was the common language. So, like, actually, they call it the vulgar language, the vulgar tongue, meaning like everybody speaks at the common language, and like the translation of the Bible that they had that was translated into Latin is still referred to as the Vulgate Bible to this day. So at any rate, the point is I'm getting down the rabbit trail, but basically the Visigoths are not the Roman population. They kind of accept that there's nothing they can do about it, but at the same time they don't really care for these people because they're part of this Arian sect, and it prevents them from kind of blending and assimilating and becoming one people with the natives. So during the reign of Justinian, the Byzantines take back part of southern Spain, and they're actually welcomed by the population. And just for reference, Justinian, he was the emperor, the Byzantine emperor, from 527 to 565. So King Leovigild, the Visigoth king who ruled from 568 to 586, tries to get the Roman population to convert to Arianism, but he's not willing to use force or any type of abuse. He wants to persuade rather than coerce. So he tries to kind of take his Arian sect and mimic some of the practices of the Catholic Church, like adopting some of their symbols and practices, but still retaining the Arian heresy, in order to kind of say like, hey, we're just like you, you can join us. But it doesn't work because, of course, they have no interest in accepting the heresy. However, Leovigild also begins to push the Byzantines out of Spain, and he takes Cordoba from them, which is another place I've visited. And Leovigild is followed by his son Recared, who rules from 586 to 601. And Recared decides to openly and blatantly convert to Catholicism, and he gets all the Visigoth nobility and clergy to convert with him. So after this, the Roman population is finally able to accept the Visigoths, and they begin to assimilate with one another and start to become one people. And then there's another king, Swinthila, who rules from 621 to 631, and he pushes out the last of the Byzantine holdings. And people are more okay with this because the ruling class is no longer like, they're no longer pushing this alien religion, so they're okay with it now. Or maybe not everybody's okay with it, but they're more willing to accept. So the Visigoth rulers, they also try to act like the Byzantines. They wear these really elaborate robes, and try to kind of adopt some of the pomp and imagery of the Byzantine emperors. And they also reserve the right to appoint bishops and to call ecclesiastical meetings. So they can require all the bishops to assemble in Toledo for a theological conference. Visigoth custom was to vote for kings, but not everybody votes, just the nobility. So the hereditary succession that usually happens in monarchies didn't always happen with the Visigoths. Sometimes they might approve the king's son to take over, but it's not a guaranteed thing. They also had a tendency to assassinate unwanted kings. So if somebody tries to, somebody that they don't want tries to override their election, that guy might just be killed. His days are numbered. The Catholic bishops attempt actually to protect the monarchy by anointing kings, like having an anointing ceremony after the elections, and also establishing procedures. They didn't like the idea of, the king being killed, basically. Okay, so in 680, King Wamba, and I couldn't believe that was the guy's real name, but apparently it is. King Wamba is deposed, and this creates some instability in Spain. The problems are blamed on the Jews, who are then put under pressure to convert to Catholicism or, potentially be turned into slaves. So they start to persecute the Jewish population, basically, and the Jews become very resentful of it. And then after the death of King Witiza in 710, the nobility prevent his son. His son's name was Aquila. So this is another king. King Witiza dies in 710, and the nobility doesn't let his son take the throne. They don't want him. So instead, the throne is taken by Roderick, who's the Duke of Baetica. And Witiza's family doesn't take it very well. They're enraged by it. So they actually ask for help from the Muslims to overthrow Roderick. And let's see, the new Muslim governor of the area that today we would call Morocco, is a guy named Musa ibn Nasser. And he is almost 70 years old at the time that he takes his office, but he's still interested in conquering more territory. So, as I mentioned earlier, the only Byzantine presence that remains in Africa is Ceuta. And the reason it survives is because it's not easy to take over. I think to take it, they have to go through kind of a narrow place. So it's very easily defended, and the Muslims are not able to take it by force. The guy in charge of Ceuta is just, today he's known as Julian of Ceuta, or Count Julian of Ceuta. And he might have either been a Byzantine governor or exarch. Most likely he was a governor that was isolated from the rest of the Byzantine Empire. And as a result of his isolation, decides to just attach himself to the Visigoths. And his job basically is to defend Spain from Africa. So if anybody tries to launch an invasion up into Spain, they have to go through him first. Maybe they can go around him, but it would take a bit longer. And still during this time, the Muslims haven't really gotten very good at shipbuilding. So it's not so easy for them to just cross the Mediterranean, even at this narrow choke point. So there's some issues with Count Julian. Yeah, sorry, go ahead. You got a question?
No, I'm listening.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's some issues with Count Julian, like there's some debate over whether or not he actually existed, and over the role that he played, and whether or not these events occurred. And one of the issues is there aren't a lot of European records that mention this guy by name that are from the time period. Like there's no contemporaneous European record, at least as far as I've seen. And most of the records about this guy come from Muslim sources. Maybe all of them do, actually. So there's some doubt, that maybe the Muslims just made this guy up. However, my position is he's a real guy, but probably we can't be completely sure if he really did everything that's attributed to him. There's also debate about his ethnicity, whether he was a Greek, a Berber, and as some people suggest, maybe even a Goth. Most likely, he was of Greek origins, because of course the Byzantines, they usually appointed their own people. Like the Byzantine Empire was, they ruled over a lot of populations before the Muslims took it all away from them. But they usually would appoint Greeks to be in charge of the different provinces. So most likely he was Greek. The story goes basically like this, and it kind of varies. But Julian sent his daughter Florinda, who today is also known as I think Florinda la Cava. He sent her to the royal court of Roderick, where she was either a lady in waiting, or she was there for education, or she may have been there as a hostage to ensure the good behavior of Julian down in Africa. No, it's uncertain. But basically, while she's there, Roderick decides he impregnates her. Don't know if it was willing or if it was forced, but Julian is so enraged by it that he decides he wants to let the Muslims invade Spain in order to punish Roderick for impregnating his daughter. And Julian might have been persuaded, he may have also been persuaded by the Witiza faction of Visigoths. At any rate, anything that's going to come from Africa is going to have to come through Ceuta, or at least that's the easiest, most practical way. So it should be noted that Ceuta was the only place in the Maghreb and maybe all of North Africa where ships were still being built. So, like I said, for the first few centuries of Islam, they really did not know much about shipbuilding, and they were at a serious disadvantage, against foes that had actual navies. So the early days, they had little to no navy during the early days of Islamic expansion. It was mostly like overland invasions. And also, Aquila may have asked for help from Julian in order to overthrow Roderick. So it could be that all these things happened at once, and Roderick snuggling Julian's daughter was the straw that broke the camel's back and made him decide to just become a full traitor. Julian works mainly with a guy named Tariq ibn Ziyad, who was the Muslim governor of Tangier. And Tariq is either a Berber or a Persian. He's described as being tall and having red hair, pale skin, and blind in one eye, with a mole covered in hair somewhere on his body. Like I saw one source saying on his shoulder, I saw another one saying on his hand, so I'm not really sure. But that was like something that was significant to Muslims. And Julian brings Tariq and his army across the straits into Spain. So what I want to do now is, I gotta say something. So as far as like Tariq's physical appearance, I know in the past I said that he had like blonde hair. Yeah. I'm not sure if it was blonde or red. The images that I've seen of him, just two. Like one is a period image, contemporary image, and another one was made like hundreds of years later. They both show him as like having blonde hair, and one of them he's got a mustache. So I don't know. Most likely he was. I think most likely he was a Berber that converted to Islam. A lot of Berbers, they do have pale skin, and red hair is pretty. It's like more fairly common among them compared with other African populations for sure, and compared with Arabs definitely as well. So what I want to do now is quote from a Muslim historian. His name is Abd Irrahman ibn Abd al-Hakim. Yeah, his name's like a sentence, basically. Yeah. But he wrote the story of the conquest of Spain. I want to read part of it here. So, according to Abd al-Hakim, Tariq put himself in communication with Ilian and treated him kindly until they made peace with one another. Ilian had sent one of his daughters to Roderick, the Lord of Andalus, for her improvement and education, but she became pregnant by him. Ilian, having heard of this, said, I see for him no other punishment or recompense than that I should bring the Arabs against him. He sent to Tariq, saying, I will bring thee to Andalus. Tariq being at the time in Tlemcen, and Musa ibn Nusayr in Kairouan. But Tariq said, I cannot trust thee until thou send me a hostage. So he sent his two daughters, having no other children. Tariq allowed them to remain in Tlemcen, guarding them closely. After that, Tariq went to Ilian, who was in Septa on the straits. The latter, rejoicing at his coming, said, I will bring thee to Andalus. But there was a mountain called the Mountain of Tariq between the two landing places. That is, between Septa and Andalus. When, by the way, Septa is an old name for Ceuta, is the old Latin Roman name for it. Anyway, when the evening came, Ilian brought him the vessels, in which he made him embark for the landing place, where he concealed himself during the day, and in the evening sent back the vessels to bring over the rest of his companions. So they embarked for the landing place, none of them being left behind, whereas the people of Andalus did not observe them, thinking that the vessels crossing and recrossing were similar to the trading vessels, which for their benefit plied backwards and forwards. Tariq was in the last division which went across. He proceeded to his companions, Ilian together with the merchants that were with him being left behind in Alchandra, in order that he might the better encourage his companions and countrymen. The news of Tariq and of those who were with him, as well as of the place where they were, reached the people of Andalus. Tariq, going along with his companions, marched over a bridge of mountains to a town called Cartagena. He went in the direction of Cordova. Having passed by an island in the sea, he left behind his female slave of the name of Hakim, and with her a division of his troops. That island was called Hakim. When the Muslims settled in the island, they found no other inhabitants there than vine dressers. They made them prisoners. After that, they took one of the vine dressers, slaughtered him, cut him in pieces, and boiled him. While the rest of his companions looked on, they had also boiled meat in other cauldrons. When the meat was cooked, they threw away the flesh of that man which they had boiled, no one knowing that it was thrown away. And they ate the meat which they had boiled, while the rest of the vine dressers were spectators. These did not doubt, but that the Muslims ate the flesh of their companion. The rest, being afterwards sent away, informed the people of Andalus that the Muslims feed on human flesh, acquainting them with what had been done to the vine dresser. So basically, from the way that it sounds, they stopped on this island, and it was like a wine growing place with vineyards, and they killed somebody, cut him up, and cooked the pieces. But then they did like a switch between the pieces of this guy and some meat, I guess like beef or pork. No, not pork. Beef probably, or lamb, and then they ate that, and they deliberately made the people think that they were going to cook and eat them, and then they deliberately let them go in order to spread the word. And of course, this is too early for anybody to really know. Still, like Europeans, apart from maybe the Byzantines, were not really acquainted at all with Islam. So for all they know, that this is what they're doing. They're going to eat us. And then, it's a little bit of
Trickery or bluffing.
Trying to spread terror, and demoralize the people. So that was the account. Abd al-Hakim, what he says about it. So Musa asked permission from the Caliph to invade Spain before they launched the invasion. And he grants permission. So first they're going to send scouts, and the scouts, they return with loot and slaves. And then the invasion begins in 711, and Tariq is in charge of it. And Julian brings all of his troops across the straits into Spain. So probably didn't move them all at once, but back and forth, like Hakim says. And first they try to land in Algeciras, but they encounter some strong resistance from the Visigoths, so they move away and land somewhere else. And instead, he lands his forces near Algeciras, near on the side of a mountain, or near the side of a mountain, which they call Jabal Tariq, which means mountain of Tariq, I guess in Arabic. And is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And today it's called Gibraltar. And this is where the name Gibraltar comes from. It's a garbled corruption of Jabal Tariq. So the governor of the area, his name is Teodomiro. He tries to push the Muslims out with a force of 1,700 men, but he's defeated by Tariq's advanced force, like the first troops that he lands. And then more troops are being brought in from Africa while this is going on. So Algeciras and Tarifa are conquered and turned into bases, and Julian is actually put in charge of Algeciras. At the time of the invasion, Roderick is actually in the north of Spain fighting against the Basques. And in case any of our listeners don't know, the Basques are a very old population. They're actually a non-Indo-European population, which was there before the Romans invaded Spain, and they never fully assimilated to the Roman culture. They still have their own language, which is not part of the Indo-European language family. And for thousands of years, the Basque people, they've been wanting to have their own country, and they've been fighting for it off and on, but they haven't really achieved it in spite of their efforts. So Roderick, he's dealing with a rebellion of those people at the time that the Muslims invade. And he finds out about the invasion after getting a letter from Teodomiro. And I got this letter here, so I'll just read it. Teodomiro says, "Sir, hostile people have invaded here from Africa. By their faces and costumes, I do not know whether they have come from heaven or hell. I have resisted with all my might to prevent their landing, but it has been in vain to prevent it. Now they are encamped on our soil. I beg you, sir, to come to our aid speedily as possible with as many soldiers as you can get. Your coming in person would be best." So Tariq, with his initial invasion, he's got 7,000 men, which are mostly Berbers, but they have Arab officers. And the gear of the average soldier in Tariq's army was mail armor, bows, curved swords, long spears that were light, and white turbans. So, people make jokes about like turbans and stuff, like, oh, why are you going to wear a turban? So the thing is, Middle East and North Africa are pretty hot and pretty bright. So it's not like they're wearing a turban to look cool, although, some of them are probably thinking that way as well. They have mail armor on under the turban. They're wearing like head and chest and arm protection. And they may also have helmets on under the turbans. Sometimes, quite often they will, the Saracens. So why put a turban over it? Well, if you ever walk outside, like especially people that live in the South, places like Texas and Arizona, you have a car that's like sitting in a parking lot all day, and you touch the car, it's gonna hurt your hand. Like it's gonna be pretty hot. You could even potentially get a first-degree burn if you leave your hand on there long enough. So you have this metal sitting out in the sunlight. It's going to get hot. Like it's no joke, especially in Middle East and North Africa. So one thing they can do about it is wrap some cloth around it to prevent this helmet from getting too hot and killing you. So that's the logic behind that. And actually, the Byzantines, some of their troops that were stationed in the Middle East, they actually put some type of cloth covering over their helmets as well. And you can see it in like images of the Byzantine troops that were in Egypt and Syria. I think Syria. Yeah, they put this cloth over their helmets. If anybody's wondering, that's why. Because that metal is going to get very hot, if it's 100 degrees and sunny all day. That can kill you. So you gotta protect yourself from the sun as well as from the enemy, basically. But at any rate, that's what. So they also have some cavalry among them. I don't know how many, that could be why they had to go back and forth across the straits to bring the horses over as well. For 2 months, Tariq loots and pillages Spain before Roderick finally catches up to him. And Roderick, what he does is he grabs all sorts of regular people in order to quickly swell up the ranks of his army. And he has anywhere from 90,000 to 100,000 men by the time he catches up with Tariq. However, the actual trained soldiers in Roderick's army are a minority. And of those actual trained soldiers, the kind of gear that they have mail armor, swords, and battle axes. But the bulk of his troops don't have any kind of protection or professional gear at all. So most of his troops are just regular people that have had no training. They've got no armor. They're armed with stuff like bows, lances, axes, clubs, scythes, and slings. So basically, they've got farm implements, hunting implements, and basic weapons for home defense. So he brought like farmers and peasants, and said just grab whatever you've got. So it'd be like today if you got drafted and all you could bring with you is your hedge clippers, and you're off going to go fight against an army of professional invaders. That's how it would be. So the two armies meet on July 19th, 711, at the Guadalete River. By this time, Musa has sent more troops for Tariq. So now there are 12,000 Muslim troops. Roderick rides a chariot or a litter made of ivory embedded with jewels, and it's pulled by either 2 or 3 white mules. So he's going for like a white kind of theme, like color scheme. And then he wears a gold crown and a robe made out of pearls and silk. So very expensive gear. And supposedly this ostentation was normal. It was a normal part of Visigoth customs that the king would go to battle with like all this ridiculous amount of wealth. And after giving speeches to his troops, he puts on a horned helmet and mounts his war horse, which is named Oriella. If anyone's interested, his horse was Oriella. And this horse is solid white. So they fight for 2 days, and the Muslims are actually losing. And so Tariq decides that his best chance is to just go straight for the king and take him out. So on the 3rd day of battle, he personally charges towards somebody in the Visigoth ranks who's wearing some really elaborate armor. He thinks that guy's the king. And he goes running straight for him and just kills anybody that's standing in his way. It's kind of like a suicide run. And when he reaches this guy, he kills him with 1 blow. So after that, the Muslims start shouting out that they've killed the king. They've killed the king of Spain, which causes the Spanish forces to panic, and they start running helter-skelter in all directions because they believe it. And also, it's also possible, and I'm not, again, like the stories around this are not all like 100% confirmed, but there's a story that Bishop Opus leads his troops away. Like he was one of the commanders that was fighting, for the Visigoths. But Bishop Opus was the brother-in-law of Julian, so I guess he was married to Julian's sister, and he decided to take his troops and go and leave Roderick there to get killed. So it may have also been that there was some desertion going on, and that could have also been why Tariq was able to charge this guy, whoever he was. So the Spanish forces retreat in all directions, and the Muslim cavalry, they chase them down and they kill as many as they can. it's unknown what actually happens to King Roderick. Probably the guy that Tariq killed was not him, but some other noble. The body of King Roderick is never found. His steed, his horse, is actually found near a stream with the gold and jeweled saddle still on the horse, and the royal crown robe and one sandal. There's a sandal embroidered with pearls and emeralds is found nearby at the side of the river. So most likely what happened is Roderick, he may have actually started retreating before the troops did, or the guy that Tariq killed, now I'm speculating, could have been like a body double or something like that. But I don't know. But at any rate, he tried to cut and run, and he probably swam across the river, or he may have swam into the river and then been shot with an arrow, kind of like Isildur in Lord of the Rings. So the whole country of Spain begins to panic because people are starting to realize that the Muslims are planning a permanent occupation. They're not just there to raid and go back. So Tariq, he reaches and conquers Toledo before Musa can catch up with his troops. When Musa finally does get to Toledo, he actually whips Tariq across the face in front of his troops. Probably because Tariq probably took all the, didn't leave anything left for him to conquer. So maybe that's why. But what happens is after this conquest is done, Tariq and Musa are both recalled by the Caliph. So that happens in 714, and they never return to Spain. And I've seen different reasons for why this might have been. One of them was the Caliph accused them of misappropriation of funds. But one thing I've noticed about these Muslim conquests when they occur is the Caliph usually doesn't allow the generals who do the conquest. He usually doesn't let them sit there and become the governor. He usually recalls them for some reason or another and then puts somebody else, like somebody that's less of a warrior and more of an administrator, basically. So, the whole thing is like the greatest threat to an emperor or a king is a general that's more popular than they are, like somebody that knows how to use the military.
Yeah.
So the Muslims, when they conquer Spain, they do the same kind of things that they did when they conquer Egypt. They're going to destroy churches and cultural sites. And one of the churches they destroy is in Cordoba. And they build a mosque over the site. And this is, again, like Cordoba is another place I've been to. What happens is when the Spanish armies do finally take Cordoba back from the Muslims, this big mosque is still there. And rather than tear down the mosque, they decide to just turn it to a church. So if anybody's interested, like the Mosque of Cordoba, they turn it into a church. Today it's just a tourist attraction. But like they just, it's kind of, like today it looks kind of weird because it's built in this Muslim style. But then when the Spanish take it back and turn it into a church, they make some structural changes, and then they also put like, they try to put like shrines and altars and things inside of it. And the two architectural types do not go together at all. Like they don't blend. So, but you know what? It's their country. They can, they can do as they wish. So there's going to be institutional discrimination that puts a lot of pressure on Christians and Jews in order to convert to Islam. And gradually, they're going to grind down the native population, and the amount of Muslims is going to increase. And Christians, well, Jews are already a minority, but Christians will become a minority under the Muslim, in the Muslim regions that are ruled by them. So serfs, because feudalism is in operation at the time of the Muslim conquest. So serfs who convert to Islam are granted the status of freed men, and they can leave and go where they want, but they got to convert to Islam to do so. Eventually, a new social order is established, and I don't know if this was written into the law or if it was just like the custom, but basically, the ruling class are going to be Arabs, people that are actual Arabs, but with them, there's actually a distinction made between those descended from the original invaders who were officers during the attack, and those Arabs who came later on from the Middle East. So those who came later are considered a little bit lower. And then next, after Arabs, you have Amazigh or Berbers, who are like, you can think of them as like second place or second class. And they make up the majority of the troops and the occupying forces. And then third, after them, are native Europeans and Jews who converted to Islam. And so Jews and Christians are like are coming next, and they're considered to be beneath all the Muslims, and they're like fourth class citizens. And then the only thing lower is slaves. So slaves would be like the fifth class citizens, kind of. And these slaves are going to come from other parts of Europe as Muslims launch raids and capture people. But there are also going to be some sub-Saharan Africans as well. I actually found a picture of this. I'll put it in the slideshow. So yeah, it's and what's going to happen is it'll take there'll just be a few places in the north that the Muslims don't conquer. Those will gradually start to push south, and eventually they're going to retake Spain from the Muslims. But what happens is there's some linguistic divisions that develop over time. So like, in Portugal, they end up speaking another language, like Portuguese and Spanish, Catalonian. They all diverge from Latin. And that's because these different groups were isolated from each other during the medieval period, and that's due to the Muslim occupation mainly. So yeah, the last Muslim holding will be conquered in I think 1492. Like the way to remember is in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue, like that, because you have Fernando and Isabel. They get married. After they get married, they push out the last of the Muslims, which were holding out in Granada. Yeah. And then once the Muslims are gone and dealt with, they're able to focus on other things like exploring and conquering other parts of the world. So they hire Christopher Columbus. But yeah, it's a long struggle that the people of Spain have to get their country back from the Muslims. It took them hundreds of years. They call it the Reconquista, which is just like the reconquest. But anyway, the second part of his question was why did they take over? And there's really two reasons why. One is because conquering other countries and people groups and taking their stuff it brings wealth. And that's always a factor in conquest during the ancient and medieval world. Conquest brings rewards. You can say that it's wrong, and it's it's against human rights and all that stuff. But the fact is, like the soldiers in most of these raids, the soldiers get to take stuff. So like they go and they conquer some city, then they get to go and bust into all the houses and take whatever jewelry is there. Maybe grab a woman as well. So it brings rewards, and then once a territory is conquered and pacified, then you have a new tax base. So it also enriches the government. It's hard, people today, we see like the wars that are going on today, and it's harder to understand because like our wars that we have today just make us poorer. And we don't see like what they're for, like the real reasons they're not given. Yeah. But that wasn't the case for most of human history. Like conquest occurs because it is lucrative to do so. The other reason, though, coming to Islam is that the Quran tells them to go and conquer the infidels. It tells them to make war on the infidels and to take their stuff. I believe that Islam, it divides the world into two parts. You have the, oh goodness, what is it? The Dar al Islam,
Yeah.
and the Dar al Harb. And Dar al Islam just means abode of Islam. Dar al Harb means abode of war. So everything that's outside of Dar al Islam is fair game to wage war upon. And one of the articles, like I'm not a I'm not a big expert on Islam, on the Quran. You probably know a lot more than I do, but like one of the articles that I read for the Muslim conquest of the Maghreb, they were good enough to provide some Quran verses where you can go and look up those verses and see what their motivations were. Like it's justified theologically for them to do that. So at any rate, that's all I've got. I don't know if you want to add anything or any questions.
No, I think you covered. I think you covered it. We see that the Muslim conquest. They are following the original ways of the Prophet. So now, keep in mind they are. Islam is a political ideology, and it does move their politics. And when they're the majority, they can take control, or when they're in a position of war. But when they're in a minority, they have to practice taqiyya, become permanent friends, or say that they're friends, be friendly with the occupying nation. And this is how it is. So thank you for this great, uh, 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 just sharing with us about this conquest.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. We live in a time where, like Europe, for example, they're underneath the European Union, most of the countries in Europe, and so they don't really have like full sovereignty at the local level. Their borders are controlled by, or at least partially controlled by, this foreign organization, which is the EU. And for years, they've been getting all sorts of Muslims coming in from North Africa, Middle East, Pakistan, a lot of like sub-Saharan African immigration as well. And I had somebody in one of the chats that wanted us to talk about immigration more. And most people today in Europe, they're atheists or agnostics. They don't really like church attendance for most European countries today is like 1 or 2% of the population is a regular church attender. It's so, and of course the average person in any part of the world doesn't really know history. And with any sort of European population, maybe not everyone, but starting in the late 20th century, and then of course the century that we're in now, there's this ideology being pushed that if you're European, or any kind of European descended person, you should not be proud of your heritage. You should be ashamed of it. Like it's a bad history and all this. I mean, I'm sure you've seen it going through public education, like I've seen it as well. But the thing is, like during the medieval period, which I talked about in the last video, you weren't there for it, that I did. You had Muslims come in and invade in Eastern Europe and also in Western Europe. They tried to take over all of Europe, and your native Europeans were put as like the lowest thing, except for slaves. But even the slaves, those were also mostly like Europeans as well. It was a very oppressive system. It was worse than Jim Crow, which used to exist in the United States and the South. Like a lot of people are outraged about Jim Crow, and rightfully so. It was a shameful thing. But you have to understand that these things happen over and over again throughout history. Like you have to just, you can't say it's bad if it happens to this group, but it's good if it happens to this one. Like either something is good or it's bad. It doesn't become uh it doesn't become good because all of a sudden it's being done to some other group. Like either it's good or it's bad. Like either getting shot in the face is good or it's bad for you. Like there's no arguing about it. So, people aren't really like there's like this huge mass wave of, they call them refugees, coming from these Muslim countries, but people don't know that for hundreds of years, their ancestors fought to push these people out, and all the different and they weren't pushing them out because of any kind of racial ideology or supremacist ideology. It's because they didn't want to have to live with things like forced conversion, or your kids being carted off to slavery, or your daughter being struggle snuggled or put into someone's harem, all that kind of stuff. And they say that Europe has some sort of moral obligation to accept these people, and because the EU is there, it's hard for the actual governments of these different countries to just oppose and close their borders. Even countries like Poland, where they say we don't want these people. The problem is they're still part of the Schengen zone. So like once anybody, whether it's a legitimate refugee or it's an economic migrant or just a straight up invader that comes in, they can move freely around inside the Schengen zone once they're there. So it's very tough, and I think a lot of people forget, they don't know history. They forget that this was what was fought against for hundreds of years. And just because, Europe is no longer Christian and is out of touch with its ancient heritage doesn't mean that these Muslims are. Like, they're the same mentality as like Tariq ibn Ziyad and Musa and the Ottoman Turks. They have not changed. So you can't just, you can't have like an ideology where you think that your culture is bad and you have no collective rights, that anybody should be able to come in, because that's like, taking the locks and doors off of your house and announcing to everybody that, hey, I won't do anything to you if you come in my house, even if you take stuff. Obviously, your house is going to get trashed out, and
Sure.
it won't just be people that come in, it'll be like insects and animals too. Like, you can't live that way. And I find it unfortunate, that most people aren't interested in history and don't understand it, and that they don't take the time to understand other cultures too. You need to really look at history. You need to understand different religions. You need to understand different cultures. Like, you need to understand the world. And in my view, and maybe you can tell me if you think so as well, I think one human lifetime is really not long enough to understand the world or the human condition. You really need to look at what's happened before in order to understand what's going on now and to be able to anticipate where we're going, which most people don't do
Right.
that.
Sure.
Yeah. If the Spanish people had not managed to push out, like if they had not managed to complete the Reconquista and push out the Muslims, then Spain would be like Egypt, don't you think?
Yeah, it would be. I agree with that.
Yeah, and I think every time I see any news from Egypt, it's always either uh, some new antiquity that's been found, which is always kind of cool, or some new horror has occurred, like something's happened or been done to a Christian.
Yeah.
Like, you do not want to be a minority in a Muslim country. It is, anyway. You know all this,
At the end of the
but
day, it's all lies. They lie and they just put up a front and or a show, and that's it.
yeah, and they can do anything to you, and you can't do anything back.
Right. Right.
You don't have a free
The
treatment in
law,
the legal system, fair treatment.
the Islamic law is sort of it's not in our favor. Even the Egyptian law, because even the government, a church is not allowed to make repairs at all, and they're not allowed to build new churches without permission from the government.
Yeah.
That in itself, they're not even allowed to make repairs. So, I mean, I don't know how that script got put out there, that narrative, how it's been able to survive for so long, how they were able to keep that narrative going without pretty much realizing all it is just marginalizing Christians and oppressing them. That's it.
You know, I mean, any place where they're in charge, you kind of have to abide by their rules. You know, and you know, the Visigoths, when they were in Spain, originally they had the Arian belief system, but they still didn't force anything. They still respected kind of the religious freedom of the native people. So,
right. Do that.
Yeah, I mean, but at any rate, I think, you know, I think that's good enough. Unless you got anything you want to add, or
Oh, no, I'm very thank you for giving us that background. I appreciate giving us another view on how a direction of a country can be going, especially when, you know, Islam begins to sort of wake up from this, or they start to complain that they're being marginalized. Just always know that it's in there. It's in their teachings. You know, a time to go to war and a time to follow taqiyya. You know, which is just deception or temporary peace with the occupation, the occupier.
Mm. Yeah, I wish, you know, that it could be patriots that were setting the policy for every country in the world, or at least for the countries that we're living in, you know, like, you know, give us some break. But unfortunately, it's not the case. And people that go through public education, what they're getting is some truth and then a lot of propaganda. Like they're not really being taught history. They're being taught not like what happened, but what you should think happened, not how to think, but what to think. You know, it's totally ideological. It's not really equipping people for life. So hopefully we, with our channel, can help with some of that. So yeah, just leave us a comment and let us know what you think. And I think with that, I will close it off.
Deus homo factus est natura mirante, unus renovatus est a Christo regnante. Gaudete, Christus est natus, ex Maria Virgine gaudete.